The dusty glass of the cafe reflected a gray, late autumn sky. Inside, the tables were empty, except for one in the corner, where a man in a dark suit slowly stirred his coffee, as if each turn of the spoon were a futile attempt to organize his own thoughts. Outside, dry leaves danced in the wind, tapping against the sidewalk, like the hurried footsteps of invisible ghosts. It was Tuesday, the end of the workday, and no one seemed to notice the heaviness hanging in the air. The last time Nathan had set foot there was 2 years ago, on a day much like this one. Same table, same suit, a different face in front of him. Back then, he still smiled with his eyes. He still believed intentions could be pure. Today, his slumped shoulders and narrowed eyes told a different story. He wasn't there to relive something, but to confront what was left of it. The city had changed. The streets felt narrower, or maybe it was just the invisible walls now closing in around him. At that very moment, across town, Lauren parked her car in front of the building she swore she'd never return to. The metal gate still creaked the same way, as if it were an accomplice to all the secrets kept inside. The elevator was slow to respond, maybe out of fear of taking her back to where everything began to fall apart. When the doors finally opened, she smelled the memory. A mix of cheap perfume, old paint, and muffled lies. Apartment 402 awaited her, intact in its structure, devastated in its essence. There was a time when Lauren believed love could be rebuilt with sweet words and small gestures. Now she knew even the most innocent gaze could be a minefield. She ran her hand along the walls, feeling the chill of the concrete and the absence of human warmth. Within those four walls, she had learned that the game of seduction was less about winning and more about control. The flashbacks came like shrapnel. Nathan handing her flowers like he was offering excuses. Lauren smiling with her lips while her eyes begged for answers. The first touch of hands across the cafe table. The last time she ran out the door without looking back. All stitched together in silence, like an emotional quilt made of broken promises and crushed expectations. Their flirtation had started as a whisper, glances exchanged in a meeting, laughter in an elevator, messages that seemed harmless. But with each new step, the line between charm and manipulation grew thinner. What started as a light-hearted game turned into a silent war. He tested her limits. She pretended not to notice. He disappeared for days. She answered with silence. Every absence was an attack. Every vague reply, an emotional grenade. By the time Lauren realized she was in a battle, it was already too late. Outside, the world went on. But inside, she was slowly falling apart. She began to doubt her own feelings. Every time she felt drawn to someone, she heard Nathan's voice in her head saying, "You're just needy." Over time, flirting stopped being light. It became calculation, fear, defense, a shield raised before anyone even got close. She no longer knew how to distinguish genuine interest from emotional strategy. Meanwhile, Nathan, on the other side of town, stared at his reflection in the cafe window. He had changed too. But unlike Lauren, he didn't cry. He simply learned how to pretend better. Learned how to use words as shields and gestures as spears. He realized he could get what he wanted with the right tone of voice, the right glance, the right kind of absence. He never needed to shout to hurt. He learned silence can bleed too. The emotional tension between them never ended. It just changed form. A blocked number. A cryptic comment on social media. A sudden appearance in familiar places. Even time seemed to conspire to keep them orbiting one another. Distant, but never disconnected. As if the universe wanted to remind them that despite the war, remnants of peace still lay in the rubble. One night, months before that quiet reunion, Lauren went on a casual date. A kind man, steady voice, eyes that truly listened. But the moment he touched her hand, she recoiled, as if the touch were a trap. Flirting was no longer an invitation. It was a minefield. Any sign of affection could be the start of control. Trauma had rewritten her emotional dictionary. Where it used to say affection, now it said threat. Where there had been connection, now lived suspicion. The emotional war born from flirtation had become a quiet cycle. The gaze that seduced was the same one that poisoned. The smile that enchanted was the same one that manipulated, and the touch that once sent shivers now froze her in place. Lauren no longer knew what was spontaneous and what was tactical. Everything was a chessboard, and she, a piece too tired to keep playing. But that night, something different happened. When Nathan left the cafe, he left behind a letter on the table. Unsigned. Just a page with slanted handwriting, words that felt like they weighed a ton. It said that love hadn't been a lie, but the way it had been handled was cruel. It said that the flirtation wasn't the problem, but what he'd hidden behind it was fear of abandonment, hunger for control, neediness disguised as charm, and a wound too old to be healed by empty promises. Lauren found that letter days later, on an empty table, left by a mutual friend who still believed in endings that made sense. As she read it, she didn't cry, but something cracked inside her, like a broken window finally shattering. What she felt wasn't forgiveness. It was recognition. The freedom of knowing what she lived through wasn't an illusion, just deeply misinterpreted. She went home that night, and for the first time in years, turned off her phone. She sat in the living room, watching the streetlight filter in through the blinds. Outside, a couple walked by, holding hands, laughing at something only they understood. And she, sitting there alone, for the first time, didn't feel envy. She felt hope, because she realized the problem was never the flirtation itself, but the undeclared wars people hide behind it. Emotional wars don't end when the other person changes. They end when we choose to stop fighting with weapons that harm ourselves. Lauren hadn't forgotten what she lived through, but she chose not to repeat it. And that, in itself, was already a kind of victory. In the distance, thunder split the sky. There was no rain yet, but its promise lingered in the air, just like the promise of a new beginning, not free of scars, but full of awareness. Because in the end, the real question isn't when flirting turned into war. When did we stop looking into each other, eyes, and start aiming for each other, weak spots? If this story spoke to something inside you, don't keep it to yourself. Share it. Someone out there might be living the exact same war, and maybe your truth is the key to their liberation.